Well, good afternoon, everybody. So I should ask, how are you all doing today? Okay, oh good. Well, I had the startling realization earlier this afternoon that after 18 months of getting accustomed to the idea that there is such a thing as Zoom fatigue, I was so energized and looking forward to being here for this first in-person conference in months, but I am now so exhausted. So I hope that you all are faring better than I am. Our panel today we've titled as Educator Insights about Human-Centered AI and focusing on 10 tips from learning science. I was tempted, I was going to convert this into a riff off of a very old joke, or the setup line for a joke, and asking the question of what happens when a learning science, an education leader, a learning engineer, and a data scientist walk into a bar. And the punchline is Jim Larimore asked them to be on a panel together. But today we really do want to cover a range of perspectives, really from almost a systems design way of thinking about how we plan for taking lessons or insights from learning sciences, turn them into things that are useful and informed by educational practice that we know around effective pedagogy or preparation and training or support for teachers, thinking about learning engineering, how technology and people get braided together in different ways, and then also to pull us back to think about data science and how important all of this is to be designed and engineered from the beginning to serve multiple stakeholders, multiple interests. So we're going to kind of roll through the conversation today, and hopefully we'll have some time. So if there are questions that you all might have or things that you might want to ask for clarification or for people to expand their thinking about, we'll be glad to have that kind of interaction as well. But we will begin, I think, by going to some of the basics, which is to ask Melina Uncapher for her thoughts about why people should care about learning science, or the kind of science of understanding learning as we venture into this work.
It's a great question. Thank you. I think there's a lot of reasons we should care about how people learn. I think the main thing is we want to figure out how to teach kids how to learn, and we want to, really engender agency over kids' ability to learn anything that they want to learn in order to live the life that they want to live. And so I think, thank you. I think the main takeaway is that every single brain is learning every single second of every single day. And so we don't actually have to teach kids how to learn because their brains are learning every second of every day. And so it's actually incumbent upon us as the adults in the system to build an environment such that what they're learning is what we think is going to help them be successful in school and in life. And so that's where the principles of learning science come in. You can see some top 10 principles of insights that we've known for 100 years, 120 years, because it turns out every single brain actually learns the same way. And so if we know that, but we know that what they're learning and how they're learning is dependent on the context and the environment and their prior history and all of this, but like the actual mechanisms of how students learn are the same across every single brain. And so that gives us scale, right? That gives us insight, that gives us insight into how we build what we need to build, and how we can do it at scale. And so that's kind of the value proposition of why might you be interested in thinking about kind of the generic principles of how kids learn. But I think some specific examples might be that there are things that we learn through research, right? Through understanding and inquiring and investigating and discovering how kids learn that we wouldn't necessarily know, but we could use as a pointer for kind of this engine of innovation that we all are looking for. One specific example might be there's this really cool insight that we learned around when you do aerobic exercise for a little bit of time, right? You get your heart rate pumping. It signals to your brain to release something that's just a growth factor in the brain. And it's called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And some people call it miracle grow for the brain. right? So you get a little bit of your heart pumping, you do a little bit of aerobic exercise, and your brain actually becomes a little bit more plastic, for a little bit more learner-oriented for a certain period of time, depending on the amount of exercise and the intensity of exercise. Well, how cool is that, right? If you then think about, what if we put gym class before math class, might that, with no extra effort on the kid's part or on the teacher's part, might that be a principle we could leverage based on what we know from how brains learn that could dramatically change outcomes? And so it's those, specific types of principles and concrete examples that could, again, point us to where we might want to commit our resources, our very limited resources, based on what we know about what works for whom, when, and under what conditions.
Terrific, thanks. And then you give me a sobering flashback to my experience as a parent of elementary school kids in Seattle, where they were eliminating recess, right, for young learners as a way to try and stuff in more time for test prep, there. And there are things that we should learn and apply, as immediately as we possibly can and as practical ways as we possibly can. So, Cassandra, I'm wondering if we could maybe pivot to you and the work that you're doing through the Branch Alliance for Educator Diversity, because as I've become more familiar with your work, it seems to me that you're focusing simultaneously on, learning from learning sciences, aligning things to try to get to higher levels of impact, and also wrapping it all around a core commitment to equity. Right, and I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit about your perspectives.
Absolutely. So the Branch Alliance for Educator Diversity is a national nonprofit organization. We're a network of 172 colleges and universities that prepare teachers. The overwhelming majority of institutions in our network are minority-serving institutions, so they are colleges and universities that already have a demonstrated commitment to diversity and equity, and they're preparing teachers to go into schools, some of our most challenged schools, most vulnerable communities. And so for us, it's important that we are equipping a diverse teacher workforce with the latest and greatest that we know about learning, about instructional practice that is explicit around issues of diversity and equity, for the purposes of moving forward learning. And I think as we begin to talk about AI and other emerging technologies, we really have the potential to leverage these technologies to eradicate some of the persistent inequities in our system, but we also run the risk of exacerbating those inequities. As we think about certainly the teachers that we prepare and the populations that we prepare, serve at Branch Ed, we think about during the pandemic, the digital divide, students who didn't have access to computers, didn't have access to internet and technology, and we think about how can we bridge that? How can we begin to think about that and solve the issues of access? We also think about getting computers in the hands of kids is not enough. Getting computers in the hands of teachers is not enough. We think about access even deeper as we think about technologies to support English language learners or students with disabilities. A huge topic here in California, again, during the pandemic, is how are we providing educational services to those occupations? And then we think about the content that is available or populated within these programs, and think about even the diverse perspectives that are needed to ensure that there is access to the content. The baseball study, right, is an example of that, where math word problems that were focused on a content that students were familiar with did better. Those students did better than those who weren't familiar with the content. And it had nothing really to do with their mathematical ability, but their familiarity, right, with the subject matter at play there. So I'm excited about the power and potential both of AI and of learning science. We are realistic, not just within our community, but broadly, about how do we begin to ensure that our in-service, in-practice teachers are ready, willing, and able to maximize the use of this information in their classrooms. And then we think about the future of the educator workforce. How can we begin to think about pre-service teacher prep? and how are we embedding these principles, learning science in particular, right? How are we embedding it within the very training and development of teachers and the teacher workforce? So we have a lot of power and possibility with what's here, and also should be mindful of some of the risks.
Well, that's great. Well, it strikes me too that for folks who are here who are working with ed tech companies, and when you think about the kinds of professional development support that teachers might need, that considering the opportunity to provide input for people who are doing pre-service teacher training gives us a chance to really think generationally about how we make progress over time as uniformly as possible, right, across the country or in other countries as well, right? So, Michelle, you and I have known each other for a little while, and one of the things that I didn't know about you until this earlier this summer is that you're an engineer who then became a teacher, right? And so, well, when we refer to people as learning engineers, like you're the real deal. And I'm curious because you've also been a very thoughtful advocate for the idea of teacher-in-the-middle approaches to the use of AI or other technologies. And I'm wondering if you could maybe unpack that a little bit and tell us how you're thinking about these issues and what might be helpful for people here in the audience to know.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So what Jim just mentioned, this idea of educator in the middle or teacher in the loop or human in the loop, you hear some of these languages when we talk about AI and implementation of AI. I think that really what that stems from is this space of really recognizing that it's not enough for us in the community that is focused on building out emerging technologies, AI technologies, adaptive technologies, to say that we're not out there to replace the teacher. Like, that's not enough, right? We have to talk about the unique values that our teachers bring into the classroom, much of it based on the learning sciences and what we understand about what engages students and how students learn. And we have to be really clear about the goals and objectives of any of the AI systems that we are building, so that we can marry those two. I loved in the introduction you said braiding the humans and the machines together, and I think that that's a really, really powerful concept. And I think that it becomes really important then in our design processes, it becomes important in our implementation practices, it becomes really important in understanding what is working for different learners in different situations, to have the educators in the loop to be sharing with us what their observations. So if we build a recommender engine, how do we know that we're making good recommendations, right? We can see in the data that comes in from our platforms, student A seemed to get that, student B maybe not, but there's a lot of rich information that our educators can provide back to us as well about what they are seeing in the classroom, in the contexts in which they are. I think, there's kind of two pieces of it. One is making sure you're designing to bring those teachers into the loop. It's also really critically important to make sure that our AI systems don't do the latter of what Dr. Herring here was talking about, which was we don't want them to exacerbate inequity. And for those of you who follow what has happened with AI and ML, there are situations where bad things have happened because we didn't look or we didn't think to understand that. And having humans paying attention and giving us feedback is a really critical piece of keeping our machine learning healthy.
Okay, great, thanks. And John, turning to you on this.
Yeah, building on that point, I think that we also we risk having inaccurate results in the interpretation of our results if we don't have humans in the loop. I think the example that comes to me, the last study that I worked on when I was at ACT, we were developing predictive analytics and we were looking at clickstream data out of an LMS and then using that to predict social and emotional learning. And one of the things we found in one of the courses that was the most highly predictive features was students who used the discussion forum. And we were like, oh, here's an interesting feature, highly rated, we'll include it, right? We're getting better kind of performance and results, that's great. But we had as part of our design, and this, I'm somewhat ashamed to actually admit, it was the first time we'd gone out and talked to faculty about the results of that work. For the most part, I'd done highly scaled work where it's like we couldn't talk to 5,000 teachers. But this, we had a small number, and we went back and brought these results to this teacher, and she said, that's really interesting, because I don't actually use the discussion forum in my class in any intentional way whatsoever, right? And he said, well, why is that? And she said, the students who use that feature are the kind of eager beavers who are out there in front asking questions that they think are going to appear on the test. So it's those students who are reaching out and who are already kind of anticipating what would happen, kind of practicing the learning sciences. As Melina said, they're learning all the time. These were the students at the forefront of that. And the impact of that was that she didn't need to start using the forum more, right? It was finding ways to actually kind of capitalize on some of those student interactions. And I think many people here in ed tech companies we're all interested. I think that data is super rich, very exciting and interesting. But we risk, if we don't have human interpretation, we risk making ill-informed interpretations of what that data actually means as it's practiced and embodied without having humans in the loop.
Okay. Oh, great. Thanks, John. So what I'd like to do now is maybe kind of pivot and just ask a question or kind of set something up. And Melina, you may have a first response on this. But it seems to me that individually, you've all recognized that the sort of typical, I think, Melina, you'd used this word in a prep phone call, that the sort of waterfall methodology of developing things and teachers and students being at the end of the lowest level of the waterfall on the receiving end of things is something that we're very familiar with, and that we can see the limitations of. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit about the work that you're doing around inclusive design. And I think for the other panelists, my impressions of your work is that you have become more and more assertively inclusive in the things that you do. And I'm wondering if for those who may not have yet taken that kind of an approach, if you could each just say a little bit more about why that matters to you, or what benefits you've seen from taking that kind of an approach.
Yeah, absolutely. It shouldn't be a radical idea to say, let's get all the stakeholders to the table at the same time to scope out the problem space, to scope out the solution space, and to figure out how to put it together. But it actually is. It's a paradigm shift to say, let's not just, again, even in the very best models, right, where we're building ed tech products that are really grounded in rigorous learning science, even in that very best model, we still have this very disconnected and siloed process, this waterfall process, right? Where we do a bunch of research in labs, maybe sometimes get that research out into classrooms, but we're not actually researching in classrooms. We're taking seat time in classrooms and doing the research that displaces the curriculum. And so it's not like true real world research that's truly contextualized. So going through all these research cycles, figure out, we know a thing. We know about growth mindset. We know about grit. We know about executive functions. And we throw it over to y'all to build ed tech products and programs. In some of the best models, you bring in the user for focus groups, for some feature tweaks, and then have a fully baked product that then is released into classrooms. And not only does that take a long time, right? So we've got 3 to 5 years on the research side, 3 to 5 years on the product development side, 3 to 5 years on the uptake and implementation side. We've lost an entire generation through the K-12 system in that model, right? So it's a long model, it's full of holes, and again, it doesn't bring all of the wisdom to the table at the same time. So bringing together the researchers with the educators, with the designers, developers, engineers to the table and build an infrastructure to allow them to talk to each other. Because I can tell you, as a researcher, I use the word attention in a very different way than my educators use the word attention. The very same language is used in very different contexts to mean very different things. And so even if we're talking the same, using the same words, we're not using the same language. And so really building not only infrastructure, but processes and supports to make this paradigm shift from this linear sequential model into a more inclusive process that not only includes the educators, but also includes at the core of the work really strong commitment to racial equity and social justice, because as we were talking about yesterday, equity and innovation are not dichotomous, right? They're not actually even mutually exclusive. They are critical. We need to think about racial equity. We need to think about social justice work in our innovation work, because when you design for folks who have been historically excluded, you're designing at the margins. And in a way, if you do it in ways that have been really well developed, like the principles of targeted universalism, you design at the margins and you build better products for everyone. You build better systems for everyone. And so that's where you can really center the work in really strong equity, in really strong inclusivity. And it doesn't have to be at the expense of innovation. It's actually at the benefit of innovation. But would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I'm going to +1 everything you just said. And I think I want to complicate, or at least give voice to some of the challenge of collaboration. Not too long ago, Branch Ed had an initiative where we brought higher ed teacher prep faculty together with K-12 in-service teachers together with researchers, and we spent a lot longer than we thought we would have to getting to a shared understanding of what success was going to look like for the collaboration, talking through language, as you talked about. I think when we start talking about AI and emergent technologies and learning science, like that level of intentionality around making sure that there's a level sort of baseline of engagement, baseline understanding for engagement, I think is even more important. And sometimes I hear that it's a little risky. We're going to invite teachers in to tell us what we really know well. I don't think it's about yielding one's power or expertise to another. It's actually about coming together where everyone honors everyone else's expertise, and we figure out how can we collectively get to a better end product. So it's not just about inviting educators to the table, it's about empowering them to have voice in the moment, and then sharing the responsibility for the outcome in a way that you have a community. We have a principle at Branch Ed called a community of learners, where everybody is bringing their expertise, but everybody else is also coming to learn from the expertise of one another. And so as a community of learners, we can come together and build a better product without feeling like we have to yield somehow our expectation or expertise, or yield our power, right, to another by virtue of the title that they bring into the conversation.
Yeah, that's actually so powerful what you just shared with me. So I had this opportunity. I'm a contributing author to a book called The Learning Engineer's Toolkit that Jim Goodell has put together. It's going to be great. It isn't quite out yet. But within there is this notion, there's a chapter, I think it's actually called Learning Engineering is a Team Sport. And it speaks to the different voices that have to come together into the table. And in the course of writing contributions for that book, I had the opportunity to chat with the Massachusetts Teacher of the Year for this past academic year, and it was on Zoom because COVID and all, and what was really interesting to me. So this woman gets on the call. She's fabulous, energetic. You can tell that she is just incredibly passionate about her students. And she looked at me in the Zoom space and she said, "I am deathly intimidated by you." And I thought, well, thank you for sharing that, right? But it talks to this power differential of you are the researcher or you are the engineer and I am just the teacher. And I think that dynamic is something that we have to be very explicit about, very careful about, because I can assure you that she was a better teacher than I ever probably was in my teaching career through some of the things that she had been doing in her classroom. And so I appreciate you acknowledging that when we get these collaborative groups together to play a team sport, we have to think about, like, who's playing the captain's role? Like, who's the goalie on this one? Who's the referee, and bringing in, because all of those dynamics can really influence the outcomes that we're going to have. And I do think that when you start talking about like our neuroscientists and our, there are some social dynamics there that we just have to be really sensitive to.
But I think also at the end of the day, right, we can't be successful in AI and our algorithms unless we have the end users also there at the table defining what's useful. I mean, Michelle, as you've said frequently in our conversations, what are you optimizing for, right? Like designing algorithms, designing kind of our accuracy levels. Like one of the projects we did at Blackboard, we were trying to design this algorithm for detecting plagiarism early on using technologies. And we could have done this for a really long time, but we got early results and we went back to the program manager and said, like, we're getting really a lot of false positives here. Like, do you think we should keep going? Because we can improve this, but we're going to keep working on it, for a couple months, and And he said, no, that's not going to be helpful, and we don't want false positives on plagiarism, because that's going to be really potentially very dangerous, and potentially problematic. So I think it isn't just a nice to have, I feel like in this, and even if you're optimizing, very technical problems, like knowing those thresholds do require bringing in your end users at the center, people to make those kind of decisions that I don't think there's necessarily like a standardized approach for. We know what our best practices are, what we can hope for, but I think at the end of the day, knowing what they are and what's going to be useful, really, it is important to have these embedded. And I think there's a lot of work going on right now to develop learning platforms, to instrument platforms, some of the work I've been involved in, and that's going to be a very important component of that.
Yeah.
I would say also it's important to have educators at the table as you begin to think about implementation and rollout.
Sure.
As we look across school districts across our country, the reasons for adopting different technology solutions are very different. The technological literacy, and I would even say value system of educators around the role of that technology and how it relates to the curriculum is important. So being eyes wide open, really, not even just in the build of the technology, but the deployment of it. I think educators have a real important lens to share.
Yeah, and I think some of this, like there's work around data literacy, our users are not sufficiently, and I'm just like, I don't think that's the problem, right? I think you developed an unusable dashboard, not meeting people's needs. And we've been focused on optimization, I think, at the expense of figuring out, like, are we building something meaningful and useful?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. So for those in the audience who know me, so you may know that part of my family background is Comanche, and I would say that one of the things that has occurred to me in hearing each of you speak about sort of more inclusive strategies or accounting for kind of equity or concerns is that especially in this past 2 years, because of the pandemic, where parents have played, or families and guardians have played a significantly larger role in providing educational support or being the teachers, the in-person teachers for their children, that one of the elements of this is that not every parent had the same educational experience or relationship with schools and education that we might think about. And many of the people who are involved in the industry sector have kind of grown up in environments where school really worked for them, right? Or where they had the wraparound supports that really benefited them. So the idea of inclusive design, as a sociologist as well, kind of makes me think, so one of the things we really have to think about is how comfortable are we reaching out across the aisle or across difference to connect with people who may have had very different growing up experiences, different learning experiences than us. And I'm wondering if you could just briefly share your own insights about kind of finding your own comfort zone in doing that work, or being open and listening so that you can understand a little bit about where people and people who may be leading organizations that you haven't collaborated with before might be coming from, right? So how, for anyone who's willing to take a first bite at that.
Yeah, I'm happy to kick us off, but I know you all have experiences with it. So, we've had in our program, our inclusive R&D program, that is very I guess you could call it equity forward. Other people have called it equity in your face. This was before. This was in 2019. We had to do a lot of level setting across the sectors. We had to have a think about who our researchers were and how they researched, and do they have values around taking seat time from students. There's this really great article, if you guys haven't read it, by Chicago Beyond called "Why Are We Always Being Researched?" or "Why Am I Always Being Researched?" From the perspective of a kid in Chicago who is always a researcher in her classroom, and there's no direct benefit. The researchers in these scenarios come in, take time and resources, and don't directly give back to any direct benefit to the teachers, to the students, to the school. Maybe they might bring candy, but that's about the extent of it. And so thinking about how do we cultivate a culture of respect and just you talk about not ceding power, but actually I do think there's some power that needs to be ceded in these types of environments where we have culturally given researchers in particular a huge amount of kind of social capital. And so because of that, we've kind of created this cycle of like elevating the researcher. And so I think we need to kind of counterbalance that a bit with exactly what you're talking about. And so, we have to break down some very strong and pervasive cultural norms, and that is not something you can do in a workshop. It's not something you can do in a day. It takes continued commitment. And actually, we talk a lot about not creating safe spaces for folks to explore their own personal equity journey and our collective commitment to racial equity and social justice. But we talk about creating brave spaces, exactly, where you can step into that hard conversation. You can step into the fact that I may not have the same experiences as you. And that's fantastic. That's actually the diversity that we're looking for. And so being able to actually not only create that brave space, but also then continue to celebrate it and elevate it and say, if I'm not hearing these conversations, we're not doing the work. And so just kind of modeling that new behavior. But curious how you think about it.
No, I agree with everything you said, and I would add that, again, at Branch Ed, we talk about leading by listening. And sometimes, even if we have a thought in mind, an agenda in mind of what we want to do in a space, we need to start by listening. We recognize that we're outsiders in the space, and so how do we get to know the context, the communities, the institutions that we're attempting to serve? We don't do that by talking first. We do that by asking questions and then listening intently. And so I think that that's hugely important. The other thing that I would say is, in this space, I feel like there are a sufficient number of folks that are bought in that want to charge the summit. And so maybe it's playing to those strengths. And I'm going to shamelessly plug here, teacher prep. We want to talk to you if you want to do work around teacher prep, around in-service professional development. We have ideas in this space about how do we begin to really push toward more equitable outcomes for students. So finding those organizations that are like, you know what, we're going to come to the table with some expertise, but we're going to say up front, we don't know it all. That's why we need you. That's why we want to be in partnership. I think we can do it on an individual level, find those teachers that have the bandwidth and the time, but I think there are also consortiums and organizations that represent broader audiences that might help us get started faster and go deeper.
For me, it's been learning the right questions to ask, right? And I think to, again, Michelle's point, that I've gone into many conversations with faculty and students, and there's this huge power differential. Oh, there's this expert in the room, and it's like, no, the whole purpose of this is to optimize something you're going to use, right? So we need to know if this is meaningful or useful to you, figuring out how to kind of, remove that power from the equation and make sure we're asking the right questions. And again, I've asked a lot of the wrong wrong questions as well. Like if you ask optimization questions around algorithmic choice, we tried to do that, right? Thought it would be important. Not so much, right? It's more the interpretation, the application, those type of questions, I think, that can be, I think, it's the right way to approach that, I think, inclusive design, and to make sure we don't come in as, I think that the expert in the room, or you don't deny that, but go in asking for that person's expertise that we respect and recognize as well.
Yeah, it reminds me of something that I know very good product managers do. So when we talk, like if you think about the pragmatic marketing framework, which probably many of you have engaged in, there's something called the Nihito visit. Nothing interesting happens in the office. And I think that, for those of us that kind of sit on the side of the computer looking at the ways that our algorithms are working or not working and that type of thing, as company leaders, think about how you are getting the people who sit behind the computer working on those algorithms into situations that sometimes are uncomfortable. Jim, I worked with ACT for some time and got to go on this fabulous tour of South Chicago schools that was incredibly eye-opening. And so, think about how as company leaders, you're engaging the folks who are working behind the scenes and in the office in what they can observe and what happens outside of the office, because I think that becomes really, really powerful. And we're all learning all the time, and so trying to keep everybody's minds open to the notion that no matter how much there's been learned, we still have a lot to learn, I think is really important.
That's great. So with the almost 4 minutes that we have left, I'll just put in maybe a little more of a plug for something. That if you are interested, if the organization that you're working with is interested in finding other organizations that are kind of aligned and wanting to take a more inclusive approach, thinking very hard about how to use AI or other kind of learning technologies responsibly, ensuring the safety and data security and other things that are so essential. We launched yesterday the Edsafe Ai Alliance, and if you go to edsafeai.org, you'll see an increasing number of logos of companies and organizations in the U.S. and internationally that are joining that movement. And I think it is, it's a forum for identifying potential collaborators, thought partners, in addition to the organizations that these wonderful folks are leading and working in. With the now 3 minutes or so that we have left, I want to maybe ask you to think about investors, philanthropic funders, government sources of support, and think about so where we are in this age of ed tech. I think really kind of being potentially ascendant in its importance or its potential contribution to learning and in education. But what words of advice would you have to people and organizations that are effectively shaping the field, right, or at least mapping the edges of the field and the things that are being supported and prioritized?
It's a great question. Tech is a tool, right? It can be used for good. It can be used for evil. In the industrial age, we've had all sorts of big step function increases. When the printing press first came out, it was demonized, right? As like books were going to cause moral laziness in our girls, not our boys, just our girls. Moral laziness, books. And now all we want to do is have our kids read books and not be on their iPads, right? So like with every step function increase in a new type of technology, there is an opportunity for weaponization, and there's an opportunity for real deep step function improvements. And so just thinking about that as kind of the intentionality of the tools, I think is just a big guiding principle.
Time. Teachers work about 50 hours per week, and only 49% of that time is actually spent on instruction. If there are ways that we can try to give teachers time back, think about what do machines do well, what does the technology do well, that can free up time for teachers for that in-person, direct instruction, direct support of learners.
Yeah, I would say I'm fortunate enough to work for a company, Edmentum, that has a social impact investor. And I will say that the drive for outcomes and impact that we have in partnership with our investor has driven some really incredible efforts within our organization to make sure we never lose sight of learner outcomes and we never lose sight of our educator first mantra. And I think that can be a very powerful lever as we look at how companies are engaging in this space, resourcing it.
I got 10 seconds, so I'll say interpretable models of AI ensuring transparency to engender trust is what I would call for, and on time.
Spot on. So please join me in thanking these folks.